You're at your desk at 7:40 on a Tuesday morning, coffee going lukewarm beside your keyboard, reviewing a supplier contract for a product line that will generate, at best, an extra 2% margin if you get the terms right, and you catch yourself, mid-sentence, actually caring about the outcome, genuinely invested in whether this specific clause survives the next round of negotiation. Your net worth crossed $30 million 11 months ago, verified, liquid enough that you could walk out of this office today, this literal morning, and never generate another dollar of earned income for the rest of your life without your family noticing a single change in how you live. You've run the numbers more than once, out of curiosity, the way you check the weather for a trip you're not actually taking. The math isn't close. You could stop entirely, tomorrow, and the only thing that would change is the 2 hours a day you currently spend at this desk. You don't stop. You haven't stopped. You've had, at this point, for separate conversations with your wife about whether you even want to keep doing this, and each time, the honest answer that comes out of your own mouth surprises you a little, because it's never the answer either of you expected going in. The question everyone assumes matters is, can you afford to stop? Almost nobody asks the actual question, which is, what happens to you the day after you do? And that second question turns out to be the only one that's ever actually decided anything. This is the part almost nobody who hasn't crossed this line understands, and almost everyone who hasn't gets defensive about when you try to explain it, because from the outside, continuing to work when you don't need the money looks either performative or slightly insane. From the inside, it's either. It's just the discovery of a much more complicated set of reasons than the ones anyone assumes. You test the theory directly, 3 years before this Tuesday morning, when you actually do stop for 4 months, a deliberate experiment rather than an accident, taken seriously enough that you told your business partners you were stepping back fully, no calls, no check-ins, a real trial of the life everyone assumes you secretly want. The first 2 weeks are genuinely wonderful, the specific, guilt-free pleasure of sleeping without an alarm, of reading an entire book in a single afternoon, of taking your daughter to school and actually lingering afterward instead of checking your watch. You remember thinking, somewhere around day 10, that you'd finally arrived at the actual point of all those years of work, and you allow yourself, for the first time in over a decade, the specific luxury of feeling like the race might genuinely be over. By week 5, something shifts, quietly at first, in a way you don't immediately recognize as a problem. You notice you're reading the same paragraph of a book 3 times without absorbing it. You notice a specific irritability creeping into ordinary conversations with your wife, over nothing, over whose turn it is to load the dishwasher, arguments that feel disproportionate to their actual content. You notice, most uncomfortably, that you've started checking industry news obsessively, tracking a competitor's product launch with an intensity that has nothing to do with any financial stake you have left in the outcome. By week 11, you're sitting in your own kitchen at 10 in the morning, nothing scheduled, nowhere to be, and you feel something you genuinely didn't expect to feel at this exact moment in your life, a specific, disorienting kind of loneliness, not from lack of company, but from the absence of a problem worth solving. A texture of purpose you'd apparently built your entire identity around without ever once noticing you were doing it. You built $30 million specifically so you'd never have to feel obligated to anything again, and the first real test of that freedom revealed something you weren't prepared for. The obligation was never actually the thing weighing on you. The problem solving itself was the thing you needed, and you'd mistaken the exhaustion of doing it under pressure for a reason to want it gone completely. You go back to work in month 4, earlier than the experiment was supposed to run, and you don't tell your business partners the whole truth about why, just that you'd missed it. A phrase that undersells, by a wide margin, what you actually discovered during those 4 months alone in your own kitchen. Your college roommate, Prentiss, ran the opposite experiment, and watching the 2 paths unfold over the following years has taught you more about this whole question than your own 4-month trial ever could on its own. Prentiss sold his share of a logistics company for a number close to yours, around the same time, and unlike you, he didn't test the theory carefully. He simply stopped, completely, permanently, the day the wire cleared, treating the retirement as the entire point of the previous 20 years, exactly the way both of you had always talked about it back when you were 24 and broke and dreaming, together, about the day either of you would have to work again. For the first year, Prentiss seems genuinely happy, from what you can tell at a distance. Trips, hobbies, a woodworking shop he builds in his garage that he posts about constantly. By year 2, the posts slow down. By year 3, you have a long dinner with him, just the two of you, and he tells you something that stays with you for a long time afterward, delivered with a specific flatness you've never heard from him before. "I don't know what I'm for anymore," he says, not dramatically, just factually, the way you'd report a diagnosis. "I built a whole life around getting to this point, and now I'm here, and there's nothing on the other side of it. Just Tuesdays." You ask him, gently, whether he's considered going back to something, anything, even part-time, and he tells you he's tried, twice, small consulting projects that fizzled within months, not because the work was bad, but because he could never quite recapture the specific hunger that used to drive him, and without the hunger, he says, the work feels like a costume instead of a purpose. Prentiss got the exact ending both of you used to dream about at 24, and it turns out the dream was missing an entire chapter neither of you had thought to write, the one about what a person is actually for, once the thing they organize their whole identity around finally stops being necessary. You bring this question, eventually, to a therapist you start seeing partly because of the 4-month experiment, and partly because Prentiss's dinner conversation unsettled you more than you expected it to, and she gives you a framework that reorganizes the entire question for you, one you hadn't had language for before. She explains that humans, across nearly every culture and era anyone studied, seem to need 3 specific things to feel genuinely well over the long run: a sense of mastery, a sense of purpose, and a sense of connection to other people, and that money, past a certain modest threshold, does almost nothing to provide any of the 3 on its own. It can remove the fear that used to compete with them for your attention. It cannot manufacture them directly, the way it can manufacture a vacation or a house. You realize, hearing this, that your job has been quietly supplying all 3 of these things for years, disguised as a paycheck you no longer actually need. The mastery comes from getting genuinely good at something difficult, watching your own judgment sharpen over decades of real decisions with real consequences. The purpose comes from the specific, daily texture of solving problems that matter to actual people, employees whose jobs depend on the company's health, customers who need the product to work, a market that responds, in real time, to whether your decisions were good ones. The connection comes from the relationships built inside the work itself, people you've spent decades alongside, whose respect and company you genuinely miss if the whole structure that connects you to them simply disappeared. The paycheck was never really the reason you kept showing up. It was just the most visible ingredient in a much larger recipe, one your brain had learned to read as purpose, so thoroughly that removing the paycheck without replacing the rest of the recipe left you starving in ways you didn't expect and couldn't immediately name. The version of this you land on, eventually, after the failed 4-month experiment, and the long dinner with Prentiss and the framework from your therapist, isn't keep working exactly as before, or quit entirely. It's something stranger and more deliberate, built specifically around keeping the parts of the job that were actually supplying mastery, purpose, and connection, and cutting away almost everything else. You step back from day-to-day operations at your company, handing the actual management to a president you've spent years grooming for exactly this transition, and you keep, deliberately, only the parts of the work that light up something real in you, mentoring 2 younger executives you genuinely believe in, sitting on the board where your judgment still matters, and a single ongoing project. The supplier contract renegotiations, oddly enough, the exact kind of granular, high-stakes puzzle that first made you fall in love with this kind of work 20 years ago, long before there was any real money attached to doing it well. Your wife notices the difference almost immediately, better than you notice it yourself, mentioning one evening that you seem lighter than you did during either extreme, the full-time years or the 4 months of nothing, and you understand, hearing her say it, that she's identified something you'd only half-articulated to yourself. You weren't actually choosing between working and not working. You were discovering, slowly and expensively, which specific 2 hours a day were the ones actually worth keeping, and letting the other 6 go without guilt, because the money had already done its real job, which was never buying you an empty life. It was buying you the right to redesign a full one on purpose for the first time. Financial freedom was never actually about the freedom to stop. It was about the freedom to finally ask which parts of the work you'd only ever done out of fear, and which parts you'd have chosen anyway, on a desert island, with nobody watching and nothing at stake, and then keep only the second kind. Your daughter asks you about this directly, 17 now, home for a break, watching you leave for the office one morning on a day she knows, because you've told her the actual numbers by this point, that you genuinely don't have to. Doesn't it feel weird? She asks. Going in when you don't need to? You think about the honest answer for a second before you give it to her, because the question deserves better than the easy version. It used to feel weird, you tell her. For about 11 weeks, actually, one summer before you were old enough to remember. I thought not working was the whole point of everything I'd built. Turns out the point was never not working. It was getting to a place where the working was finally a choice instead of a requirement, and it turns out I still choose it, most days, just a lot less of it than I used to, and only the parts I'd have wanted even if the money had never shown up at all. She nods, the way 17-year-olds nod at things they'll only fully understand in 20 years, and goes back to her breakfast, and you head out to the 2 hours of work you've deliberately kept, the supplier contract still open on your desk when you arrive, the 2% margin still mattering to you in a way that has nothing to do with the number sitting quietly, untouched, in an account you haven't needed to check in months. You keep working not because the money didn't work. It's because the money did exactly what it was supposed to do. It removed every reason to work out of fear, and left standing, in the empty space that fear used to occupy, the much smaller, much more honest question of what you'd have chosen to spend your days doing anyway, and the answer, most mornings, is still this.